I have a Minolta W.Rokkor-HG 35mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. There are two versions of this lens that Minolta made with basically identical name rings. There's this version, which is the MC1 version, and then there's an MC2 version as well. They're both identically named. The way you can tell the two apart really is that the MC1 version, if you look at the focusing ring here, it's flat. So the focusing ring doesn't really go, it goes perfectly around the lens in a circle. And if you just compare that to an MC2 lens here, this is actually a 50mm lens, but if you just look at the focusing ring, it's kind of a wavy focusing ring. So it waves as it's going around to provide a little bit better grip. So that's probably the easiest way to tell the MC1 and MC2 lenses apart in general. So I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens, getting access to the diaphragm, optics, and various body sections, and taking it apart so that it can be fully cleaned and repaired. So we'll start off here on the back of the lens, just get access to the back of the diaphragm. And if there's just a tiny amount of oil on the diaphragm, it's easier to go in from the back of the lens on this particular one, and you can try to clean it off that way. Usually you actually have to get access to the diaphragm on its own though to clean it. So on the back section here, there are two sets of divots, one on the outer section here, the outermost black ring. And those outermost ones are the ones that actually remove the entire back optical piece. So those are the ones you want to use a spanning wrench on. Okay, there's the back optic right here. And the second set of divots on this back optic, those actually remove this inner ring here, which then allows you to remove some of the various elements on this back optic so that those can be cleaned on their own. And that's helpful if there's actually fungus or something inside of the back optic. The optics are pretty small, so it's a little bit difficult to work with them on the back optic. A little bit easier to work with the front optic on this particular lens. And now expose the back of the diaphragm right here. So you have access to the back of the diaphragm. You can try cleaning it off, but as I mentioned, usually you actually have to remove the diaphragm fully and take it apart to actually clean it pretty well. So now we'll take a look at the front of the lens and go in to get access to the front of the diaphragm as well. So on the front of the lens here on the name ring, there are two little divots on either side, right here and right here for a spanning wrench. But because these divots are actually so small and they're kind of recessed down inside the lens, none of the spanning wrenches I had were able to actually work here without damaging the name ring. So solution I have for this type of thing when the name ring either doesn't have divots or they're very small, find a piece of pipe, just a PVC plastic pipe here that's just about the size of the name ring, a little bit smaller than the filter ring holder going around here. So this looks good. And then I've applied two little strips of gaffer's tape. And gaffer's tape is useful because even if it goes on the glass, it doesn't leave any residue really. But it's strong enough to actually grip the name ring. And you can use this now to just provide a little bit of friction and loosen up initially the name ring. So here I've just loosened up the name ring, and now it's loose enough that I can just undo it by hand. So there's the name ring. Now you can see down into the next level of the lens. In here we have the front optic and then the filter ring holder going around on the outside there. So we're going to undo the front optic at this stage. Again, there are two sets of divots on this front optic. There's the inner set right here and here on this kind of raised up section, and then on the outermost section there's another set of divots, one here and one here, and you want to undo the outer divots. The inner divots just undo the top ring that's holding things in place. So there's the entire front optical assembly. Like the back optic, you can also then undo the second set of divots on this front optic here to start removing elements in here. And I believe that the layers in here are also just screwed together. So there might be some adhesive, but I think that the layers like this top section and the bottom section here are just screwed together, so you can actually try to undo those as well. I'd only recommend doing that if there's like a serious amount of fungus or damage inside the lens that you're trying to repair. Most times it's better to just leave it alone and just clean the front and back surfaces, because it's easier to introduce more problems or introduce smudges or more dust into the lens if you're not careful. So now we've actually got access to both sides of the diaphragm here, front side of the diaphragm, back side of the diaphragm. And as the next step, we'll actually go in and start removing the different pieces and actually be able to remove the diaphragm so that it can be fully cleaned on its own. So the next ring we're going to remove here is the ring that the filters normally screw into. So this black ring going around the top section here. And this black ring, it just screws in place, but there's a little screw that's down right here that just prevents it from rotating normally when it's on the lens. So just loosen up that screw slightly, and then this whole ring just unscrews. So there's that ring right there. The next ring we're going to remove is this brass colored ring. This one's holding in the diaphragm. There are two little divots on either side of it for a spanning wrench again. So just use the spanning wrench to loosen this one up and undo it. Alright, so there's the brass colored ring that's just holding things in place, and that was just holding on the diaphragm. So now you can actually grab the entire diaphragm assembly, just lift that right out of the lens, and there you go, there's the diaphragm disassembly. I'll just set this aside for the moment, or actually, so I'll just set this aside for the moment, and we'll take a look at it again a little bit later. So the next part of this disassembly is actually I'm going to detach this back section here, which is all the mechanical parts, from the focusing section. So just look at the back of the lens here, and a lot of these earlier Rokkor lenses use all slotted screws. So going around here, there are 4 slotted screws on the back, 4 little silver ones. We want to undo these 4. Now with these screws undone, these 2 sections should just separate. So I'll note that this indicator, it's currently set to infinity, so it's focused at infinity, and then lift off these 2 sections. You also might want to mark where things are getting lined up currently. So I'm just going to mark where the little indicator was over here by infinity with a pencil. For fitting things back together later, having a mark will help for the reassembly. One more thing on this piece is that there's a tiny spring right there that's in this pocket, and that's what normally presses the ball bearing up against the grooves on the aperture mechanism, or on the aperture ring, to make sure that it clicks and makes the clicking sound. So looking back at this focusing ring real quick, there's one other piece that we can actually take apart in here. Removing the focusing ring on the exterior here from the rest of the focusing mechanism. This is only really necessary if you actually want to clean the focusing ring. So in most cases it's usually not necessary. You can clean it okay in its current state, but if you really want to clean it well and actually clean in between all these individual grooves, you don't want to get water or anything actually in the focusing mechanism itself, because that can damage it. So you really want to separate the body section so it can be cleaned on its own. And if you look down in this ring in here, there are 3 slotted screws recessed down in here, and these are what are holding the focusing mechanism in place. One thing about this is, though, once you separate the focusing mechanism from the focusing ring, there's nothing definite that determines where it should get locked down, so you have to zero the lens after separating it in this case. So I'll just undo these 3 screws, and I think each of the screws has a little washer on it as well. Alright, now I can just lift off this. Now I have the focusing mechanism here, or the focusing ring, separated from the focusing mechanism itself right here. So I'll just set those aside, and again, you can now clean the focusing ring on its own, because it is just a body section, just a piece of metal, so you can clean it very well. Also take a quick look at this back section here and remove a few more body sections on this back section. So this is the mounting plate, and then it also has all the internal couplings and things going around in here. So the pieces that we want to remove from this back section is really the aperture ring, so that it can similarly be cleaned on its own, just like with the focusing ring that we just removed. So the first step of removing the aperture ring is removing on the mounting plate this silver ring that's going around the back section here. So this silver ring is just held in place by 3 little set screws going around here. And you can just loosen these set screws up, you don't have to remove them fully. So the silver ring just slides out of place. There's a little washer in there as well. Set those aside. And now you can see the actual aperture control ring down here. One complication with this lens is that you can't actually slide the aperture control ring off at this stage. There are two things that are preventing it. So one of them is this little lever over here that's sitting on top of the aperture control ring, and it goes from the outside of the lens on top of the aperture control ring to the inside of the lens right over here. So that's one thing we'll have to remove. The other thing we have to remove is this little coupling mechanism right over here. So this kind of brass colored bar is going from the outside of the lens on top of the aperture control ring to the inside of the lens right here. And that's actually what's coupling the aperture control ring into the focusing mechanism. So we're going to remove both of these pieces so that the aperture control ring itself can be removed. So first off, on that little lever over on the one side, with this little lever there are two little sections that really matter here. There's this whole stack of different components, and these are all held, like the little lever is held open normally by a little tiny spring over here. So one side of the spring is pressed up against the side of the lens body right over here. The other side is looped around and is going on this side of the lever right over here. So just going to loosen up this top section with the slotted screw, and be careful not to lose any of the components that go into this lever or lose the little tiny spring. Just slide this entire component out and set that aside. So remove that lever so nothing's holding it down on this side anymore. Now the other one we have to remove is the coupler over on this side. So this coupler has two little slotted screws again, one here and one here. So just undo these two. Now this little bar section should just slide out from one side of the lens. Alright, so there's that separate. Now I can actually lift off the aperture control ring. There is a little ball bearing on this lens as well that's below the aperture control ring right over here. So there's that little ball bearing that you might also want to try to remove. Alright, so there's the little ball bearing. So I'll just set that aside as well. And now we've separated the aperture control ring from the rest of the lens here. Looking back at this one last body section, you can also remove this black plate going around the back section here that just kind of keeps debris from the exterior of the lens from getting into the interior of the lens. There's not a whole lot of point to doing that unless you really want to clean this black plate. It's just held in place by these three little black screws. I'm just going to skip that step because it's not too interesting. And that actually has the disassembly of the lens pretty much complete. So it's not a very complicated lens. As you can see here, there aren't too many components. We have the diaphragm here, which can be further disassembled, separate from all the optical sections here, which also can be taken apart a little bit further if you're trying to repair those or clean inside of those. And then all the various body sections here, and some of the mechanical parts, so like the focusing mechanism, and then like the little levers and other things that were going into the back mounting plate coupling. So starting on the reassembly here, let's first get the aperture control ring back in place. So we have this back section here, and we have the aperture control ring that we need to get back in place. On the mounting plate back section over here, there's a cutout right by the mount indicator right here. And on the aperture control ring, there's a little notch section right over here that kind of sticks out from it. The cutout and the notch need to line up, and the aperture control ring should go snugly against the mounting plate like this. And there are three things that then have to get coupled in on top of the aperture control ring, or with the aperture control ring. One was the little lever, which is going to go over on this side right over here. And then we also have the bar, so this little bar section that is also going to go on top of it. But first we all have to get the ball bearing back in place. So this little ball bearing, which provides the clicking sound as you move the aperture control ring back and forth. So that little ball bearing actually has to be installed before any of these other components. And it goes right over by the focusing indicator right here. It goes in the little pocket right here. So I'll stick that there. And then put the aperture control ring in place. And now we can start reinstalling some of these pieces. So start with the part that couples the aperture control ring into the diaphragm, so this piece right here. You'll notice that it kind of bends down on one side. That side is going to go down into the lens so that the bend is sticking up if you're looking at the lens from the top. So I'll get this in place from the interior of the lens. There are the two little screws that just lock this piece in place, and I'll just get them started here. And you'll notice that these screws don't lock into a definite position. You can actually move this little bar back and forth. And this is one area that allows you to adjust how the aperture opens and closes. And in this case, I know that it kind of started at the middle position, so I'm just going to lock it down there. And then I can compare it to where I expect the aperture to be later on. And if it's not opening and closing properly, I can then go back, loosen these screws up a little bit, and move them around and readjust things. So that's one area where you can actually adjust how the aperture opens and closes here. So you have that piece in place. Now we just have to get the little lever here in place as well. And for this one, it's easier to, I think, separate the little spring mechanism here, little wire, from the lever while trying to reinstall it. So with the lever, there goes the middle section of the lever there. So with the lever, you want the little part here that's kind of sticking out from the lever, going up into the lens, and it's going to go into the lens. Let's see where it is. It's going to go from the inside of the lens to the outside of the lens and go through right over here. So I'll just get it roughly in place. And if you have it in the right position, you should see that the little bottom section here is hitting up against this post over here. So that's the correct orientation, and now I can lock this down. There's a screw hole that this should be going into as well. Okay, so this should just be moving freely back and forth. Now I have to reinstall the little spring mechanism. So this spring mechanism has two sides. One is a slight bit longer. That side's going to get pressed up against the lens body over here. The middle loop is going to go over the top of the screw here, and then this other side is going to get looped around and go against right over here and actually hold things open. So I think the easiest way to do this typically is to slide it in place, just get it onto the screw hole, onto the screw over there, and then take the other side right here and just loop it over. Okay, and once it's in place properly, the lever should spring back open automatically. So that has the aperture control ring back in place now. So now we'll also reinstall the focusing mechanism here. So we have the focusing mechanism right here, and before, during the disassembly, we kind of marked where it was lining up. So the mark right here was lining up with the indicator right here. So I'm going to line these two up, and you should see that the 4 screw holes on the back section here then line up with the 4 screw holes on the parts sticking out from the back of the focusing mechanism on this side. So just make sure that those are lined up properly. Once you have this orientation, there's one more thing that has to be reinstalled during this part, and that is the little tiny spring that goes in right here. So I'll stick this spring into the pocket right here. Slide this into position in the correct orientation again, and just kind of press in that spring as I'm sliding it down. Make sure it doesn't get too bent. And you want to make sure that it's making that clicking sound now in the current position. And to then lock it down on the back section here, make sure that the 4 screw holes are all lined up going around here. And we'll reattach it with the 4 little screws, little silver screws on the back section here. All right, make sure that it's still making the clicking sound. All right, looks good. The next step is actually getting the focusing mechanism here back in position. So looking at the focusing mechanism here, there are 2 important parts on the focusing mechanism. One is this little post over here. So this little post kind of sticking up. And And that's the one that directly controls the focusing mechanism. You can see it's kind of coupled into this entire silver crescent-shaped piece over here. It moves back and forth. And that's going to be controlled by the stop-down lever. The aperture control ring is controlling this entire gold section that's going around the exterior of the diaphragm mechanism right here. And this diaphragm, or the gold section, is actually controlling the aperture control curve over here. So this is the aperture control curve. And as you move the aperture control ring back and forth, this gold section rotates back and forth. It's moving the aperture control curve back and forth. Normally this post and this whole silver-shaped crescent piece right here is held open, and there's a little second post over here that's much shorter, and that one is normally pressed up against the aperture control curve, so that as the diaphragm, or as the aperture control curve moves back and forth, the aperture opens and closes because this little post is going up and down along the aperture control curve. So that's how everything's going to get lined up. On the actual aperture piece as well, there's a little knob over here, and that is also going to help with lining everything up here. So looking at the lens body, the post right here that's going to go for the stop-down lever is going to go back through this section right here to the actual stop-down lever. So you can see there's a little pocket right here, and that right there, it's the same thing. So that's where the post is going to go. The little fork-shaped piece right here for the aperture control curve to get hooked onto the diaphragm mechanism is going to go onto that little piece that we previously removed that was one of the pieces that was sitting on top of the aperture control ring. So there's this little thing jutting out over here. That's where the fork is going to go. And finally, that little screw piece right here needs to go into the gap right here. So it needs to go right like there and actually get locked in place properly. So I find the easiest way to line this up is first line up the little screw over here with the gap that's going to go into with the little track system. And then next line up roughly, kind of eyeball where the little piece over here lines up with the fork for the aperture control curve. And line those two up. So just drop these two pieces together once it looks like they're lining up. And then on the back section of the lens, and this is a little bit easier to do if you actually do remove the black plate here. But you can just kind of eyeball getting the fork into the correct position. And then to actually get the third component, that little lever in place, just work the little stop-down lever back and forth until it lines up properly. And it should just drop in place there. So if everything is lining up properly, moving the aperture control ring should open and close the aperture, and then also hitting the stop-down lever should work as expected. To actually lock down the diaphragm, I'm going to use this brass-colored ring. Just screws in place on the top section here. And I'll lock it down using a spanning wrench. So as I mentioned before, the aperture is actually looking pretty good in this case, but if the diaphragm is not opening and closing properly, you can actually adjust how the little piece right here, which is coupling the aperture control ring into the diaphragm mechanism, falls within these two little slots right here. So you can loosen up these screws, nudge it over a little bit, nudge this piece over a little bit, tighten it back down until you get the diaphragm opening and closing properly. Just continue on with the back reassembly now and finish that off. So we have the back section here, this little part of the mounting plate, this little silver section. It has the washer that goes on the top here, just goes around the top of the mounting plate on the back section. And then on the actual silver section itself, there's a little cutout over here, and that goes over on top of the lever. And then you'll also notice that on this piece there are little indentations for the different screws to go into. So you just want to make sure that the screws are lined up when this piece gets locked in place. And then tighten down the 3 little set screws on this. You can also reinstall the back optic at this stage, so it just screws in place. And I'll use a spanning wrench to lock it in place as well. Okay, so that has the back reassembly all complete. Doing things in a slightly different order here. So also reinstall the front optic. So it just screws into the top section. And now here is where you actually need to reinstall the focusing ring. So this is one of the more challenging parts because once you take apart the focusing ring, it doesn't lock down in a specific position any longer. So you really have to take the lens out and zero it. The way the focusing ring is reinstalled is with the 3 little screws right here. So these 3 little screws each have little washers and they go down into the little screw slots right down here into the focusing ring. So I'll just install these 3 little screws first, get them started, and then explain how you would actually zero this lens. So the problem is that the focusing indicator, right now it's saying it's at infinity, for example, over here, may no longer actually match what the actual optical focus of the lens is. And at this stage we have the entire lens optically reassembled, and you have the mounting plate back here, all in working order as well. So what you'd want to do at this stage is actually take the lens outside, mount it on your camera in its current state, and then have the focusing ring here just loosely reattached to the lens. And that allows you to spin around the focusing ring independently of the actual focusing mechanism. And I'll just pick a position like 0.06 over here, kind of in the middle of the focusing ring, and I'll just lock one of the screws down right here. So I lock one of the screws down, and now I can actually focus the lens optically. So I'd spin it back and forth until it's actually optically focused at infinity. So I'd look at some very distant object, make sure it's properly optically focused to infinity. And I'll just say that like that's optically focused to infinity. Now I'd loosen up the focusing ring again here so that I can spin it around independently of the focusing mechanism. And just rotate it around so now the indicator is also indicating infinity. So now it's both optically focused at infinity and the indicator is correctly indicating infinity as well. And now you can actually lock all the various screws in here back down because we know that it's properly zeroed. So that's how you would zero the lens. For this video I'm just going to assume that it has been properly zeroed. I'm not actually going to take it outside or do any of that. That is the procedure you would follow to do a proper zeroing. And once you do lock the lens back down, you want to make sure that it can focus over the entire range of the focus smoothly. So it can go between infinity and the minimum focusing distance of 0.4 meters over there. Nothing's getting stopped in the middle, so it's a smooth focus over the entire range. Just 1 or 2 more components here. To complete the reassembly, we have the filter ring holder here on the front section. It just screws in place. And then there's also that little set screw right over here, right here, to prevent it from spinning around. And then finally, just reinstall the name ring here. It just screws in place as well. And it has the 2 little divots for a spanning wrench, but I'm just going to use the pipe section again to tighten it back down. Okay, so that has the entire reassembly of the lens complete. You can check and make sure that everything is working as expected. Focusing, aperture control, and the stop down lever on the back section here. Overall, this lens is a little bit more complicated than some of the later Minolta lenses, but it does use all high quality metal components and it's not overly complicated. There aren't too many parts. It's just things like the aperture control ring. Actually removing that requires a bit more steps than something like an MC2 lens or one of the later W.Rokkor-HG lenses would typically require, just because it does have this earlier type design. But it is a very repairable lens in that you can access all the different components pretty easily. You can take apart the optics and actually get in and repair those without too much trouble. So overall, a lens that's not too hard to take apart, a few annoyances, and one that's pretty repairable as well.